Yeah, she's from the Caribbean somewhere. You really want me to read this to you? Okay, stop me when you don't want to hear it anymore. How's that? Okay. The absence of writing, or how I almost became a spy. I wasn't hardbacked, but I definitely wasn't no spring chicken when I started to write, as a way of living my life, I mean. Although, like a lot of women, I had been doing it on the quiet, filling up all kinds of notebooks with poems, thinkings, deep and not so deep, curses and blessings. The last thing I expected to end up doing was writing, and when I upped and left a safe and decent profession, second oldest in the world, they say, for writing, I was the most surprised person. It is in those growing up years as a child in Trinidad and Tobago that you will find the how and why and wherefore of this take me by surprise change. If someone had asked me when I was growing up to tell them what pictures came to mind when I heard the word writer, I would have said nothing. What I wanted to be most of all was a spy, and after reading about spies in World War II, spying was much more real to me than writing. After all, there was an empire, and we, its loyal subjects, had to defend it. Black and brown middle-class people, my family, short on money but long on respectability, belonged to this class, wanted their children to get good jobs, and better yet, go into professionals. Massa Day was done, and dreams were running high. My son, the doctor. Education was open to everyone, girl and boy alike. My daughter, the lawyer. And if your son or daughter didn't manage to get that far, there was always nursing, teaching, or accounting. Failing that, there was always the civil service. Some people might say that this was normal, since the writers we had heard about, all white, had usually starved, and you couldn't say this about doctors or lawyers. Salvation of the black middle classes, so we believed, and a profession was the best proof you had to put servitude behind you, and were becoming more like the upper classes. Writing was no help in this at all. In high school, I was learning about many things: English literature, French history, American history, and finally, in my 5th year, West Indian history. Poor ass cousin English history, the name V.S. Naipaul was there somewhere. V.S. Naipaul, writer. It was a sister of his who taught me in high school who first mentioned him to us, her students. But V.S. Naipaul was Indian, and in the context of Trinidad at that time, in the eyes of the blacks, this was a strike against him. V.S. Naipaul, the writer, we didn't understand or care to understand. Maybe without knowing it, we were already understanding how he was going to use us in his writing life. Books for show. I wasn't no stranger to them. They were all around since my father was a headmaster and living in the city, that I could get to the library easily. Books for show. Rows and rows of them at the library. As greedy belly, I read my way through Dostoevsky, Moravia, Shakespeare, Dickens. Books for show. Other people writing them, I was reading them. I wasn't different from any of the 20 or so girls in my 6th form class. None of them were looking to writing as a career, or even thinking the thought as a possibility. Profession, vocation, career, we all knew those words. The black and brown middle classes, scholarship girls whom our teachers were exhorting to be the cream of society, the white salt of the earth. Profession, vocation, career, anything but writer. Some people are born writing, some achieve writing, and some have written writing thrust upon them. My belonging is to the last group, coming slowly to accept the blessing and yoke that is writing, that which so doing I have come upon an understanding of language, good English, bad English, Queenlingish and Kinglish, and anguish that is English in colonial societies. The remembering, the revolutionary language of Massa Day done, change fomenting, not in the language of rulers, but in the language of the people. Only when we understand language and its role in a colonial society can we understand the role of writing and the writer in such a society. Only then, perhaps, can we understand why writing was not, and still, to a large degree, is not recognized as a career, profession, or a way of being in the Caribbean, and even among Caribbean people resident in Canada. She moved to Canada. What follows is my attempt to analyze and understand the role of language and the word from the perspective of a writer resident in a society which is still very much colonial, Canada, a writer whose recent history is colonial and continues to cast very long shadows. Fundamental to any art form is the image, whether it be the physical image as created by the dancer or choreographer, the musical image of the composer and musician, the visual image of the plastic artist, or the verbal image, often metaphorical, of the writer and poet. For the purposes of this essay, I will be confining myself for the most part to the concept of image as it relates to the writer. While, however, it may be quite easy to see the role of image as it relates to the visual artist, it may be less easy to do so with respect to the writer. The word image is being used here to convey what can only be described as the irreducible essence, the I-image, of creative writing. It can be likened to the DNA molecules at the heart of all life. The process of giving tangible form to this I-image may be called I-imaging, or the I-imagination. Use of unconventional orthography, I-image, in this instance, does not only represent the increasingly conventional deconstruction of certain words, but draws on the Rastafarian practice of privileging the I in many words. I-image, rather than image, is, in fact, a closer approximation of the concept under discussion in this essay. In her attempt to translate the I-image into meaning and non-meaning, the writer has access to a variety of verbal techniques and methods: comparison, simile, metaphor, metonymy, symbol, rhyme, allegory, fable, myth, all of which aid her in this process. Whatever the name given to the technique or form, the function remains the same, that of enabling the artist to translate the I-image into meaningful language for her audience. The power and threat of the artist, poet, or writer lies in his ability to create new I-images, I-images that speak to the essential being of the people among whom and for the artist creates. If allowed free expression, these I-images succeed in altering the way society perceives itself and, eventually, its collective consciousness. For this process to happen, however, a society needs the autonomous I-image maker, for whom the I-image and the language of any art form become what they should be, a well-balanced equation. When in the early 1900s, Picasso and his fellow artists entered their so-called primitive stage, they employed what had traditionally been an African aesthetic of art and sculpture and succeeded in permanently altering the sensibilities of the West towards this aesthetic. In the wake of European colonial penetration of Africa and Oceania, the entire art world was, in fact, revolutionized, and the modernist art movement was born. These changes did not necessarily increase the understanding or tolerance of the West for Africans in Africa, but people began to perceive differently. I-images then comprised the African aesthetic had previously been thought to be primitive, naive, and ugly, and consequently had been dismissed not only by white Westerners, but by the Africans themselves living outside Africa. So far were Africans themselves removed from their power to create, control, and even understand their own I-images. The societies in which these New World Africans lived, North and South America, England, the Caribbean, lacked the needed matrix in which the autonomous I-image maker could flourish. The only exception to this is to be found in musical traditions where, despite the hostility of these predominantly white societies, the African I-image maker in musical art forms was successful in producing authentic art, which has also permanently influenced Western music. Caribbean society has been a colonial society for a much longer time than not, and the role of the I-image maker, and I-image control are significant. The societies that comprise the Caribbean identity may be identified by A, the significant lack of autonomy in the creation and dissemination of I-images. B, opposition to the ruling classes both at home and abroad to the creation of I-images that challenge their I-image making powers and status quo. C, restricting of indigenously created I-images to marginal groups, example reggae and calypso. While changes like independence have improved some of these circumstances both within the Caribbean and within Caribbean societies and the large metropolitan centers overseas, these factors continue to affect the artist and particularly the writer. The tradition of writing for the Caribbean and Caribbean people is a brief one, and briefer still is the Afrocentric tradition in that writing. Gets more exciting. I argued above that at the heart of all creative writing is the I-image. The tangible presentation of this is the word, or word symbol as I prefer to describe it. The success of the execution of this I-image, be it poetical or in the extended metaphor of the novel, depends to a large degree on the essential tension between the I-image and word, or words given voice to the I-image. Tension is created by the interplay of I-image and word. image creating word, word giving rise to further image, and so on. This process is founded upon familiarity with word and image. Familiarity being used here in the sense of being kin to, part of, related to. What is assumed here, but probably should not be, is also a growing familiarity with being and how it relates to the outer world. If this process is as it should be, then the autonomous image image maker serves the function of continually enriching the language by enlarging the source of images, in particular metaphorical image. If we accept the living language continually encapsulates, if we accept that living language continually encapsulates, reflects, and refines the entire experiential life and worldview of the tribe, the race, and consequently of society at large, and if we accept that the poet, the storyteller, the singer, or balladeer, through their words, express this process in their work, then we must accept that this process becomes one way in which a society continually accepts, integrates, and transcends to experiences positive or negative. For it is through those activities, poetry, storytelling, and writing, that the tribe's experiences are converted and transformed to image and to word almost simultaneously, and from word back to image again. So metaphorical life takes place, so the language becomes richer, the store of metaphor, myth, and fable enlarged, and the experience transcended not by exclusion and alienation, but by inclusion and the linguistic psyche, the racial and generic memory of the group. The progenitors of Caribbean society as it exists today created a situation such that the equation between image and word was destroyed for the African. The African could still think the image, she could still conceive of what was happening to her, but in stripping her of her language, in denying the voice power to make and simultaneously to express the image, in denying the voice expression, in fact, the ability and power to use the voice was effectively stymied.
All straight.
We could go further and argue that with the withering of the word in the New World, not only did the image die, but also the capacity to create one's own image. The bridge that language creates, the crossover from image to expression, was destroyed, if only temporarily. Furthermore, alien and negative European languages would replace those African languages recently removed, and, irony of all ironies, when the word-image equation was attempted again, this process would take place through a language that was not only experientially foreign, but also etymologically hostile and expressive of the non-being of the African. To speak in other languages, to enter another consciousness. Africans in the New World were compelled to enter another consciousness, that of their masters, while simultaneously being excluded from their own. While similar prohibitions extended to music at various times, language was one of the most important sites of struggle between the Old World and the New World. The outcome of this struggle was the almost absolute destruction and obliteration of African languages. Together with the accompanying act of renaming by the European, this was one of the most devastating and successful acts of aggression carried out by one people against another. African musical art forms probably owe their survival and persistence to the fact that they were essentially non-verbal. Once the image-making power of the African had been removed or damaged by denial of language and speech, the African was then forced back upon the raw experience without the linguistic resources to integrate and eventually transcend it. The resulting situation became one in which the African was decontextualized, except insofar as her actions generated profits for the owners. The language within which that decontextualization flourished was in itself and at best a decontextualized one for the African. At worst, the language would serve to destroy. Language therefore succeeded in pushing the African further away from the expression of her experience and consequently the meaning of it. The African in the Caribbean could move away from the experience of slavery in time. She could even acquire some perspective upon it, but the experience, having never been reclaimed and integrated metaphorically through the language, and so within the psyche, could never be transcended. To reclaim and integrate the experience required autonomous image makers, and therefore a language with the emotional, linguistic, and historical resources capable of giving voice to the particular images arising out of the experience. In summing up his efforts to augment the English language in the 16th century, Sir Thomas Elyot wrote, quote, "I extended to augment our English tongue, English, E-N-G-L-Y-S-H-E, whereby men should as well express more abundantly the thing," again, T-H-Y-N-G-E, "that they conceived in their hearts, wherefore language was ordained, hang wordus apt for the purpose," end quote. That the African needed to express, quote, "more abundantly the thing they conceived in their hearts," end quote, is undisputed. That the English language lacked, quote, "words apt for the purpose," cannot be denied. Over and above her primary function as a chattel and unit of production, the English language merely served to articulate the non-being of the African. The purpose for which language was ordained would remain unfulfilled. I would argue further that it is impossible for any language that inherently denies the essential humanity of any group or people to be truly capable of giving voice to the images of experience of that group without tremendous and fundamental changes within the language itself. In this instant case, however, since there was no possible expression of the New World experience within any African language, the imaging could only be expressed through the English language. Essentially, therefore, what the African would do is use a foreign language expressive of an alien experiential life, a language comprised of word symbols that even then had affirmed negative images about her, and one which was but a reflection of this experience of the European ethnocentric worldview. This would eventually become her only language, her only tool to create and express images about herself and her life experiences, past, present, and future. The paradox at the heart of the acquisition of this language is that the African learned both to speak and to be dumb at the same time, to give voice to the experience and image yet remain silent. That silence has had profound effect upon the English-speaking African-Caribbean artist working in the medium of words. Speech, voice, language, and word all are ways of being in the world, and the artist working with the image and giving voice to it is being in the world. The only way the African artist could be in this world, that is, the New World, was to give voice to the split image of voice silenced. Ways to transcend that contradiction had to and still have to be developed, for that silence continues to shroud the experience, the image, and so the word. As the poet Cecilia Bustamante writes in The Poet Her Text, quote, "Within this radius of language, she discovers that having adapted herself as a vehicle of communication for historical and cultural moments between a dominant culture and a dominated one, language is becoming one more tool of subordination, replacement, pressure, and distortion. Its potential is unexpressed, a proof that it suffers from margination, a proof that it suffers from margination of the dominated, or rather, the threat of being unable to internalize her own culture which has been violated. In order to express this reality, the social functions of language, it fosters either its communicative values or silence. Reflecting a similar stress, it detects the multiple structures of violence. Its authenticity is tested in the confusion of recognition and the tense structures of violation and domination that, whether paradoxical or contrary, are always obstructive. This is the dilemma of the dominated, to disappear or change at the prices of their lives." End quote. Concerning literature in the Caribbean, C.L.R. James has written that, quote, "Language for us is not a distillation of our past. If by language is meant Queen's or King's English as we know it, this statement is true, because that language, for all the reasons given above, can never be a distillation of our past. But what the ordinary African, the African on the Papine bus, or the Port of Spain route taxi, or the Toronto subway, produced from the only linguistic behavior allowed her, that is functionality, at its barest level, in the English language, is truly and surely a distillation of her past. It may not be the clearest distillation, but it remains a distillation all the same. In the vortex of the New World slavery, the African forged new and different words, developed strategies to impress her experience on the language. The formal standard language was subverted, turned upside down, inside out, and even sometimes erased. Nouns became strangers to verbs and vice versa. Tonal accentuation took the place of several words at a time. Rhythms held sway. Many of these techniques are rooted in African languages. Their collective impact on the English language would result in the latter being, at times, unrecognizable as English. Bad English, broken English, patois, dialect. These words are for the most part negative description of descriptions of the linguistic result of the African attempting to leave her impress on the language. That language now bears the living linguistic legacy of a people trying and succeeded in giving voice to their experience in the best and sometimes the only way possible. The havoc that the African wreaked upon the English language is, in fact, the metaphorical equivalent of the havoc that coming to the New World represented for the African. Language then becomes more than a distillation, it is the truest representation, the mirror image of that experience. Language of the people, language for the people, language by the people, honed and fashioned through a particular history of empire and savagery. A language also nurtured and cherished on the streets of Port of Spain, San Fernando, Borcer village, and Sangre Grande, in the look, Shide, and Lay we go, in the mouths of the Calypsonians, Jean and Dinah, Rosita and Clementina, Mama Lookaboo, the Cusbuds, the Limers, the Hoss whores, the Jacobats, and the market women. These are the custodians and lovers of the strange, wonderful, you tink it easy jive, as kick-ass massa day done chamarangas, as we own old mass, pretty mass, pan sweet language. I'm killing it. A more accurate description of this language would be to call it a demotic variant of the English, the Caribbean demotic. The excitement for me as a writer comes in the confrontation between the formal and the demotic within the text itself. In the absence of any other language by which the past may be repossessed, reclaimed, and its most painful aspects transcended, English in its broadest spectrum must be made to do the job. To say that the experience can only be expressed in standard English, if there is such a thing, or only in the Caribbean demotic, there is such a thing, is, in fact, to limit the experience for the African artist working in the Caribbean demotic. It is in the continuum of expression from standard to Caribbean English that the veracity of the experience lies. One can never be less than self-conscious as an African Caribbean writer working in any of the demotic variants of English, whether the demotic variant be a form of standard English or Caribbean English. And for the writer from the Caribbean, language must always present a dilemma. At its most simple, the dilemma can be resolved to an either-or dichotomy. Either one writes in a demotic variant of English, or one writes in straight English. Choice of one or the other in this scenario is often seen as a political choice, and much bad writing takes place on either side of the divide in the name of linguistic validity. It is not sufficient, however, to write only in a dialect. For two, then, there remains a parallel and closed experience, although part of the same language. Neither is it sufficient to write only in what we have come to call standard English. The language as we know it has to be dislocated and acted upon, even destroyed, so that it begins to serve our purposes. It is our only language, and while it is our mother tongue, ours is also a father tongue. Some writers, Derek Walcott and Wilson Harris, immediately come to mind, having publicly acknowledged their gratitude for the blessing conferred on them by the imposition of the English language, and have, in fact, refused to acknowledge that there even exists a dilemma. Others, like Earl Lovelace, have taken up the challenge that the anguish that is English presents for all African Caribbean people. The issue is, however, much more complex than either-or dichotomy suggests. The place African Caribbean writers occupy is one that is unique, and one that forces the writer to operate in a language that was used to brutalize and diminish Africans so that they would come to a profound belief in their own lack of humanity. No language can accomplish this, and to a large degree English did, without itself being profoundly affected, without itself being tainted. The challenge, therefore, facing the African Caribbean writer who is at all sensitive to language and to the issues that language generates, is to use the language in such a way that the historical realities are not erased or obliterated, so that English is revealed as the tainted tongue it truly is. Only in so doing will English be redeemed. Subversion of the language has already taken place. It began when the African in the New World, through alchemia, the art of the black in Egypt, practices succeeded in transforming the leavings and detritus of a language and infused it with her own remembered linguistic traditions. Much more must now be attempted. If we accept the earlier premises that at the heart of the language lies the image, metaphorical or otherwise, and that to the artist falls the task of articulating and presenting this image to the people, then the attack must be made at the only place where any true change is ever possible, at the heart of the language, the image and the simultaneous naming of it. The African artist in the Caribbean and the New World must create in, give voice to, and control her own images. This is essential for any group, person, or people, but more so for the African in the New World, since in one sense, our coming upon ourselves, a revelation to ourselves in the New World, was simultaneous with a negative representation of ourselves to ourselves by a hostile imperialistic power, and articulated in a language endemically and etymologically hostile to our very existence. In a very real sense, it can be argued that for the African in the New World, learning the English language was simultaneous with learning of her non-being, her lack of wholeness. The experience of the African in the Caribbean and the New World is now, however, as much part of the English collective experience as England is part, for better or worse, of the African experience. In the same manner, for instance, that Germany will always be a part of the Jewish collective experience and vice versa. That experience expressed in the language, a language that is shared yet experientially different in both groups, has been and continues to be denied. Hence terms like broken or bad English or good English, all of which serve to alienate the speaker even further from her experience. If the language is to continue to do what language must do, if it is to name and give voice to the image and the experience behind that image, the thing we conceive in our hearts, and so house the being, then the experience must be incorporated in the language, and the language must begin to serve the recreation of those images. There are certain historical and sociological, not to mention etymological, reasons why when we hear certain words and phrases such as thick lips or kinky hair, the accompanying images are predominantly negative. Such expressions connote far more than they denote. From whose perspective are the lips of African thick or her hair kinky? Certainly not from the African's perspective. How then does the writer describe the Caribbean descendants of West Africans so as not to connote the negativity implied in the description, such as thick lips? Journal entry, December 11th, 1986. Testimony stoops to mother tongue. I want to write about kinky hair and flat noses. Maybe I should be writing about the language that kinked the hair and flattened noses, made jaws prognathous. This is how I tried to meet this particular challenge in a particular poem. It is but a small example of the challenge facing the African Caribbean writer who is interested in making English her home. The challenge is to recreate the images behind these words so that the words are being used newly. The African in the Caribbean and the New World is as much entitled to call the English language her own as the Englishman in his castle. However, just as we have had to make that image our own, so too he be made to acquire our images, since we are both heirs to a common language, albeit to different linguistic experiences. Our experiences have touched in both negative and positive ways, and we remain forever sensitive to each other through the language. For too long, however, we have been verbal or linguistic squatters, possessing adversely what is truly ours. If possession is, in fact, 9/10 of the law, then the 1/10 that remains is the legitimization process. It is probably the hardest part, this reclaiming of our image-making power in what has been for a long time a foreign language. It must be done. It is perhaps ironic that New World Africans, descendants of cultures and societies where the word and the act of naming was the focal point and fulcrum of societal forces, should find themselves in a situation where the word, their word, and the power to name was denied them. Traditionally, for instance, in many West African societies, until named, a child did not even acquire a recognizable and discernible human identity. In the New World, after the destruction of the native peoples, Africans would be renamed with the name of the stranger. If what the artist does is create her own image and give name to that image, then what the African artist from the Caribbean and the New World must do is create in, while giving name to, her own image, and in so doing eventually heal the word wounded by the dislocation and imbalance of the word-image equation. This can only be done by consciously reconstructing, reshaping, and, if necessary, destroying the language. When that equation is balanced and unity of word and image is once again present, then and only then will we have made the language our own. This is not a conclusion. What happens when you are excluded from the fullness and wholeness of language? What happens when only one aspect of a language is allowed you, as woman, as black? What happens when the language of ideas is completely removed and nothing is given to replace it? Surely thought requires language. How can you, without language, think or conceptualize? What happens to a language that is withheld or only used in a particular way with its users? Does it become disassociated? One level business, one level orders, commands, abuses, brutality, one level education to a specific purpose and level. What of celebration? What of love? What of trust between individuals? There can be no conclusion to the issues raised in this essay, since language is always and continually changing, a fluid phenomenon. One version of this paper was published many years ago in the journal Fireweed, 1983, and at that time I called this section postscript and wrote that it was, quote, not a conclusion because the issues raised here are still very much undecided. The questions I raised then were, how does one begin to destroy a language? How does one replace the image behind the word? I replied then that those questions remained unanswered and would probably remain so for a long time. I am now struck at how prescient I was in that original article about many of the issues I was to deal with in my writing subsequent to the writing of the paper. The absence of writing could be seen as something of a blueprint for my poetic and writing life. Have I answered those questions, or do they still remain unanswered? I believe I have come closer to answering them than I did 6 years ago. The manuscript, She Tries Her Tongue, has taken me a long way towards the goal of decentering the language. This is not the same thing as destroying a language, which is a far harder thing to do. Also, destruction connotes great sturm and drang when, in fact, what words just as well at times is a more subtle but equally profound approach. For instance, in the poem Discourse on the Logic of Language, the issue that I raised in the earlier postscript, that of father tongue vis-a-vis a mother tongue, some sort of balance is achieved despite the anguish of English and despite the fact that English is both a mother tongue and a father tongue. In the accompanying journal I kept as I worked on She Tries Her Tongue, I write as follows. I am laying claim to two heritages, one very accessible, the other hidden. The apparent accessibility of European culture is dangerous and misleading, especially what has been allowed to surface and become de rigueur. To get anything of value out of it, one has to mine very, very deeply, and only after that does one begin to see the connections and linkages within other cultures. The other wisdoms, African wisdom, needs hunches, gut feelings, and a lot of flying by the seat of the pants, free falls only to be caught at the last minute. It calls for a lot more hunting out of the facts before one can even get to the essence, because in almost exact reversal with European culture, not much has been allowed to surface. I'm almost tempted to say that one can, for that reason, trust that information more. I'm almost tempted to say that one can, for that reason, trust that information more. I must add now that the lack of information bears directly on one's ability to make images. The linguistic rape and subsequent forced marriage between African and English tongues has resulted in a language capable of great rhythms and musicality, one that is and is not English, and one which is among the most vital in the English-speaking world today. The continuing challenge for me as a writer-poet is to find some deeper patterning, a deep structure, as Chomsky puts it in my language, the Caribbean Demotic. The challenge is to find the literary form of the Demotic language. As James Baldwin has written, quote, Negro speech is not a question of dropping S's or N's or G's, but a question of the beat. At present, the greatest strength of the Caribbean Demotic lies in its oratorical energies, which do not necessarily translate to the page easily. Just as the language that English people write is not necessarily or often that which is spoken by them, so too what is spoken in the streets of Trinidad or by some Caribbean people in Toronto is not always going to be the best way of expressing it on the page. To keep in deep structure, the movement, the kinetic energy, the tone and pitch, the slides and glissandos of the Demotic within a tradition that is primarily page-bound, that is the challenge. In the former postscript, I wrote that it was perhaps ironic that a critique of the use and role of English in a particularly brutal historical context should be written in standard English, but that in itself throws into sharp relief the dilemmas described above. I was not completely satisfied with my argument then that the dilemma as to what language was appropriate was answered by my argument that the English language in its complete range belonged to us, and whatever mode best suited our needs should be used. In fact, the problem was that the piece itself did not, as I now believe it ought to, reflect that range that I spoke of. Unlike the former piece, the opening paragraphs of this present piece explain the absence of writing in my early life, are written closer to the Caribbean Demotic than to standard English. Could or ought I have to continue the entire piece in this style? Perhaps, but I do believe that the present piece is a far truer reflection of how I function linguistically than the original one. While I continue to write in my father tongue, I continue the quest I identified in 1983 to discover my mother tongue, trying to engender by some alchemical practice a metamorphosis within the language which from the father tongue to the mother tongue. Will I recognize this tongue when I find it, or is it rather a matter of developing it rather than finding it? Whatever metaphorical images one uses, discovery or development, the issue of recognition is an important one, since implied within the word itself is the meaning, the image of knowing again. There was a profound eruption of the body into the text of She Tries Her Tongue. This represents a significant development for me as a poet. The manuscript has become a blaze among a poetic path. In the New World, the female African body became the site of exploitation and profoundly anti-human demands, forced reproduction along with subsequent forceful abduction and sale of children. Furthermore, while the possibility of rape remains amorphous threat it is, the female body continues to be severely circumscribed in its interaction with the physical surrounding space and place. How then does this affect the making of poetry, the making of words, the making of images if poetry, as I happen to believe, begins in the body and ends in the body? She Tries Her Tongue is the first blaze along the path to understanding and resolving this particular conundrum. I continue, as I did in the former postscript, to see the issue as being one of power and so control. I still, as I did then, fear being reductionist, but writing does entail control in many areas. Control of the word, control of the image, control of information which helps in the process of image making, and equally important, control in the production of the final product. By the time the manuscript She Tries Her Tongue comes into print, it will be almost 2 years and many, many rejections after its completion, despite its winning the Casa de las Americas Prize in 1988. As a female and a black living in a colonial society of Trinidad and Tobago, control was absent in each of these areas, hence the absence of writing, especially creative writing, and hence the lack of recognition of writing as a possible vocational profession. As a female and a black presently living in a society that is, in many respects, still colonial, I refer here to Canada's relationship with the United States of America, and a society which is politely but vehemently racist. While I may have gained some control of my word and its image-making capacities, control of information and production is still problematic. For the many like me, black and female, it is imperative that our writing begin to recreate our histories and our myths, as well as integrate the most painful of experiences, loss of our history and our word. The reacquisition of power to create in one's own image and to create one's own image is vital to this process. It reaffirms for us that which we have always known, even in those most darkest of times which are still with us, when everything conspired to prove otherwise, that we belong most certainly to the race of humans. That's it.